Hi everyone, welcome to Conversations with Curtis. Today on our show, we have LucasArts legend, Noah Falstein. You probably know Noah from his highly acclaimed Indiana Jones adventure games, but did you also know that he was the first project leader on the Dig? Either way, we'll talk about all of this and more in my conversation with Noah Falstein. Noah Falstein, welcome to Conversations with Curtis.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Now, as I usually do in these conversations, I want us to start at the beginning. How did you get into game design?
It's always hard to answer that one exactly. I guess on the one hand, I started making games out of, toys and cardboard when I was a kid. So it's very easy to look back and say, that was a sign that I was meant to be a game designer. But I'm sure I could have, I also had a chemistry set, and if I had become a chemist, that would have been the obvious thing. But really, what got me started on computer games was a class in college, my first year of college. I had a little bit of experience programming and dealing with some very, very simple games in the early 1970s, when I was still a child. And it didn't really, wasn't very interested. It was text only at that time, was even pre pre the earliest, Zork and all that sort of really interesting text ones. But in college, I thought I would be perhaps a physics or astronomy major. Ended up taking some math classes. The math teacher said, "Oh, everybody should learn how to program a computer at this point." So I took a computer class, and at the end of the class, the person teaching it said, "Anybody who wants to stick around, we have some games on the mainframe we can show to you." And those games were a little more sophisticated and just got me hooked. And from then on, through college, I made some very early, at first text-based games, and then some of the very earliest video games. And that got me hooked and got me into the industry as soon as I graduated.
What did you do after you graduated?
Well, I had been doing a senior project that was a very elaborate computer game about mining the asteroid belt. And one of the professors who was an advisor had been moonlighting, I guess, during his summer breaks at Milton Bradley, which was about 20 miles down the road from my college. And he just serendipitously happened to know that they were hiring at the time that I was graduating. And it never occurred to me, even at that point, that there was the possibility of a career making computer games, because this was January of 1980, and there were a handful of video games out there, certainly in the arcades. This was post Space Invaders, but I never thought about who was making them. In fact, a lot of the arcade games were coming from Japan, so I didn't even think that was a possibility for me. But he connected me to one of his colleagues at Milton Bradley, and Milton Bradley was just getting into electronic games and starting to experiment with different types of computer games, including many I worked on in 2.5 years that were canceled before they actually went out the door, but they did experiment quite a bit. They even had a Milton Bradley home computer that they got within a month of releasing, and then one of their competitors came out with something so similar, they just decided not to bother.
So they gave up on the release just because a competitor came out with a similar product?
Well, so this was would have been 82, I think, or late 81, and Coleco, one of their major competitors, had a computer that came out, and our boss announced it to us by saying, "Okay, here's a riddle for you. What's a computer that uses the same CPU as the TI-99-4, does its graphics this way, has the sound card, has, I forget how much, probably 16K of RAM." So, well, it's our Milton Bradley home computer. Says, "Wrong, it's the new ColecoVision." And he showed us this computer that they had. Or sorry, it was Coleco Atom was the name of that computer. And it was so similar that the executives at Milton Bradley just got totally scared away just to be scooped by a competitor, and then to announce something 2 or 3 months later that looked like a Me Too copycat, even though we didn't know about it. They just figured, perhaps correctly, that it would never really go anywhere. And to be fair, the Coleco computer didn't do all that well either, so it was probably a reasonable business decision.
Maybe if you would have decided to release yours, maybe it would have been a success.
You never know. I mean, when I was at Milton Bradley, one of the other things that happened is that I was shown a um, vector-based computer game system from a company called General Computer, and my boss said, "Could you try this out and tell me what you think?" And I thought it was amazing. It was wonderful, and that actually got released as the Vectrex, which a lot of collectors are still excited about. It was, I think, for many years the only home vector-based game system you could get, and for the early '80s, it would look pretty advanced, but we had some successes and some failures.
Now, almost 40 years ago, back in 1983, you found out that Lucasfilm had a new games group. How did you find out, and when did you start working there yourself?
Well, after Milton Bradley, I went to Williams Electronics, who was one of the big pinball and arcade game companies, and I was co-designer and project leader on a game called Sinistar. And while I was there at Williams, I had a friend who was also, she'd worked with me in Milton Bradley, also came out to Chicago and was working for a competitor of Williams, but she was getting tired of it. And I don't know how she found out. I think she was talking to a recruiter, but she said, "Could you please be a reference for me? You'll be getting a call from somebody from this new group at Lucasfilm." And at that point, Lucasfilm was very well known, of course, for Star Wars, although at that time, this was, I think, just about the time Return of the Jedi was being released, and they had also done the first couple of Indiana Jones movies. But the thought that they were actually making video games was just a revelation. And these days it's commonplace that film companies are doing video games, and they're making more money on the games sometimes. But in that point, it was just unprecedented that any film company would be interested. So I was very excited. I gave her a good reference, but for various reasons, they decided not to hire her. And a few months later, we had a major crash in the arcade industry. And I called up David Fox, who's the person who had interviewed me about my coworker, and asked if there was any chance that they were hiring. And he said, "Oh, actually, we just started a new draft." And we talked, and I came out to California and had some interviews, and all went pretty well. And that was it. So starting early '84, I started to work there.
And what was the first project you worked on at Lucasfilm Games?
Well, this was before they had released any games at all. And when I came there to interview, they had Rescue on Fractalus and Ball Blazer that were pretty far along. But one of the things that they did was have me do testing, I think, on Rescue on Fractalus primarily, and also take a look at the code that they had used and get used to their software system, which was pretty similar to what I had done in the previous jobs. But for various reasons, complicated business reasons, they didn't actually release those games for another 2 years, I think. Originally, it was supposed to come out through Atari, and then Atari got bought, and the whole thing turned into a kind of a legal mess. So I started work on a game that used the fractal technology that Rescue on Fractalus had done, called Coronis Rift. And that was the first game that I was a project leader on, and first one that I released at Lucasfilm Games.
Now, the first games you've worked on at Lucasfilm, and even before Lucasfilm, you worked on mainly action games. So when it was decided to start working on adventure games, did you see it as a step forward?
Well, it wasn't quite as carefully defined. I mean, the '80s were really a time of experimentation, and even classifying games in those genres was fairly new. There certainly were text-based adventures that Infocom had made very famous, and the early graphic adventures that some of the work that Sierra had done had caught the eye of Ron Gilbert at our group. And but we had, because of our connection with Lucasfilm, because we all basically everybody in that group was just a huge fan of the Lucasfilm movies, and so we really were interested in cinematic storytelling and science fiction. And so it was kind of a natural to want to do more story-based games, so that even though the first four games that we put out were all action-based to a large extent, they also had fairly elaborate backstories, and they all had science fiction or fantasy backgrounds. And um, so it didn't seem like that much of a transition. And in particular, what happened is we got the opportunity to work on a game based on the movie Labyrinth that had been produced by Lucasfilm but not made there. And that seemed like a really good step up. We were very interested in the storytelling aspects, and that's really what got us on the path that eventually became the whole series of graphic adventures that Lucasfilm did.
Now, Ken Williams, the CEO of Sierra, once famously said that Sierra Online, at Sierra Online, they don't play competitors' games, as he always wanted Sierra to lead and not follow. Was there ever a similar request at LucasArts, or were you encouraged to review other games to see what works and especially what doesn't?
Well, the philosophies at Lucasfilm, LucasArts, and at Sierra were radically different. And I know this because most of the designers of those early games ended up becoming friends, meeting at some of the earliest game conferences. And the whole industry was very open to sharing, at least on the level of the creators. We often would get together and talk to people who were making the most direct competitors of our games, not only the graphic adventures, but I worked a little bit on our flight simulator line and the X-Wing game. And we would have long talks with Origin and their wing commander people. And it was all very friendly. In fact, we often shared information on how we had done things technically. And a lot of it was bravado. I think with all of it at that time, we didn't particularly care that we were sharing details of how we made the last game we put out, because we all felt that the next one we did would be so much better that it didn't matter. And we enjoyed boasting about what we had done to people who were our peers, who could really appreciate how difficult it was to do some of the things that we had accomplished, particularly on Commodore 64s and other computers at the time. And so I was friends with quite a few, still I'm friends with quite a few of the Sierra people. And Ken was very defensive. In fact, I know that they were out in, kind of the middle of nowhere in California, in part because he didn't want other people poaching his staff. But on the contrary, we were very open, and we're willing to talk about it. And a lot of those people, he may have told them not to play competitors' games, but they all played our games, and we played theirs. So bottom line was, yeah, we were quite familiar with what they were doing, and we're always very curious about every game out there at the time. It was possible in the mid '80s to play the 10 best games and have actually covered a big chunk of the releases for that year because there were just so few companies making video games.
Now, the first two Scum games that were released by Lucasfilm Games were Maniac Mansion and Zack McCracken and the Alien Mindbenders. And you are credited on creative and technical support for both of them. What did that entail exactly?
Well, we were very collaborative within our group, and there were a lot of conversations constantly about the games that each of us were working on, trying to help each other out and figure things out. And I ended up becoming, good friends with both Ron Gilbert and David Fox. As I mentioned, David was the first person who I contacted at LucasArts, and we have lived nearby each other. I still see him very frequently. Ron was somebody I hired to work on Coronis Rift. So I think one of my biggest contributions to Lucasfilm and to the games industry was in the people I hired and the people that they hired. I also brought in Larry Holland, who did the flight simulators and X-Wing and TIE Fighter. And by bringing in Ron, I helped with his hires of people like Dave Grossman and Tim Schafer. And Brian Moriarty, who did Loom, was somebody I met at a conference. And when I heard that he was at Infocom, I had a conversation and basically drafted him on the spot. So there was a lot of collaboration among us, and it was a very small, tightly knit group. And I just enjoyed working on those projects a lot. I knew that at some point I'd probably want to do one of my own. So with those early games with Ron and David, I mean, David actually worked on Maniac Mansion some as well. And I mean, we basically all collaborated with each other. And of course, the Scum system itself underlying it was made by the same core group of people who ended up helping with every project that was made under Scum.
Now, in 1988, Lucasfilm Games pitched a Star Trek Scum game to Simon & Schuster. When I asked Gary about it a month ago when I talked to him, he said that he didn't remember anything from that pitch meeting. What can you tell me about that pitch meeting and about the game itself?
Yeah, well, I'm not surprised Gary didn't remember because we had huge numbers of proposals and ideas of things that we had a very standardized form we did for creating designs and swapping them among our group and proposing them. Eric Wilmunder, I don't know if you've talked to him as well, but he's got a thick stack about about a foot tall of documents, and I've got one that's perhaps just slightly smaller. Many of them the same, just copies of the same games. But I was actually one of the first people involved in the Star Trek pitch because our boss at the time, Steve Arnold, I forget exactly. I mean, every one of us, I'm sure, was equally a Star Wars and Star Trek fan, but I think I was free to take the call, and he had me chat with the Simon & Schuster person, and I think there might have been a Paramount person. And they originally were very interested in our flight simulators and said, "Can you do an enterprise simulator and do that sort of thing?" And I thought, well, and that may have been actually, now that I think about it, why I got involved in it so early on. I was talking to this representative, who was the licensor, and said, the games we did were, basically single person, fighter planes or people jumping from one bomber, gunnery position to another. Essentially, the Enterprise was very different, and they said, well, we think a lot of it would be very similar. You go around, you shoot bad guys, you take off and land, you go to different planets, and so, excuse me, you take off and land, but the Enterprise doesn't land. And the person on the phone clearly was irritated with me bringing that up and said, well, look, it doesn't really matter. It's just a video game. And I just remember thinking at that point, boy, this is not a good sign. But we basically pitched them on saying, well, we have this Scum system that's really good for stories. And, Star Trek is all about stories and characters and the characters people love. What if we did something like that? And they said, well, why don't you write something up? So we did. And, Gary was our first and for a long time our only artist. So he was involved with a lot of those pitches. And that circulated around. And I think quite a few other people in the group, contributed to their ideas, and we played around with it. And I really think that could have been a hit at the time, just because nobody was doing, a graphic adventure set in the Star Trek universe. And we even had some talks with Origin, who wanted to do a Ultima-style role-playing game set in the Star Wars universe, and that also never quite happened. But those kinds of crossovers, I think, would have been very popular at the time, and of course, did become popular later on.
So they tried to pull you in the direction of a flight simulator, and you tried to suggest making it an adventure game, and then the whole thing fell apart?
Basically, yeah. I think it was a combination of them not being that easy to work with, and the experience I mentioned, and as it went on, they clearly, as a lot of movie and television companies did at the time, they clearly felt that video games were a trivial expansion. Actually, I remember our own director of licensing at Lucasfilm, after we had released, I think it was our Last Crusade game that had done reasonably well, it was our best-selling game so far. I said, hey, we're finally getting on the map with licenses, aren't we? And he smiled and said, yeah, but I could see that he was hesitant. And I said, Howard, tell me the truth. I mean, we sold 250,000 copies. Wasn't that actually significant? And he said, well, let me put it to you this way. last year, all of your games combined made less of a licensing fee for us than Star Wars pajamas alone. And it's like, okay, I guess I get it. And it didn't surprise me when he said that when I thought of all the Star Wars clothing and merchandise I had seen. I thought, all right, I guess we have a ways to go. But I think the Star Trek people had a similar feeling. You know, they were starting to make the Star Trek movies, and I don't recall whether they had started work on the next generation, but it was right around that time. And I'm sure they looked at us as a totally insignificant add-on. And we really felt that games deserved a little more credit than that. So between them losing interest and us not really, feeling that they would be that easy to work with, we just dropped that one.
Were there any other pitch meetings of the same nature around that time with other companies, other brands?
Oh, there were certainly a lot of other things we looked into. There weren't that many where we went with outside licenses. That for one thing, by the late 80s, we were starting to finally get to work on our own Indiana Jones and Star Wars licenses. And that was something everyone in the group had dreamed about doing from when we started. And for another licensing, as that same licensing person explained to me, it's a bit of a problem because if they license out Star Wars to a third party, they get the full licensing fee. If they license it out to people, to the LucasArts group internally, we still had to pay Lucasfilm Limited the same licensing fee. So it basically meant that we made less profit than if we made an original game. And if we worked on somebody else's license, then it was the worst of both worlds because we made less profit because we had to pay a licensing fee and it wasn't even our company's licensing fee. So there really wasn't a lot of encouragement about that. And if Star Trek hadn't been such a, close to our hearts kind of license, I don't think it would have come up. There were a few other things that came up. As I mentioned, we did the Labyrinth game and George was involved with a bunch of movies that were Lucasfilm movies, but weren't of the same type that we were excited about. He did a film called Tucker. There were quite a few done at Skywalker Sound that they did the sound effects for. We had some connection to, and Spielberg, who was his friend, came and edited a lot of the movies at Lucasfilm, and there was a lot of co-involvement there, of course, with ILM. So there were various times where people pitched stuff to us, but nothing that really gelled as a strong possibility, at least that I can recall. That, like Gary, I'm sure there are some things that I've forgotten about at this point.
Now, in 1989, you finally got to work on Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, the graphic adventure. How did that project come about?
Well, as I recall, so the rights to both the Star Wars games and the Indiana Jones games had been sold off before George decided to make his own games group, but under contracts that were limited to one extent or another. And there were several Indiana Jones games released in the early years I was there. In fact, I remember we did a lot of playtesting on an Atari Indiana Jones game. I think it was a Temple of Doom game. Mm-hmm. And I think what happened is that the contracts finally had expired in terms of exclusivity, and there was that possibility to do it ourselves. But it didn't even come up until the film was, I think, about a year and a half into production, and only about 9 months from being released. And then they said, again, sort of afterthought, maybe you guys would like to make a game on this. And, we got very excited. It was a real opportunity. I was the only project leader who had worked on, any of the games involving Scum who was free at that time. So I ended up being the first one to dive into it. And I realized it was just too ambitious to do justice to, this license we really cared about. And both David Fox and Ron Gilbert had more experience than I did, having done those first two games you mentioned. And so we ended up having a meeting, and it took the unprecedented step of having all three of us be co-project leaders together. That we didn't establish a hierarchy. the idea was that we would all work together on it and share equally. And all of us were very excited about that, and enjoyed working together. And uh, basically, it kind of went from there. And we didn't quite get it out when the movie released, but I think we got the game out within about 2 months. And luckily, that summer, it basically played in the theaters all through the summer because it was so popular. So it was still very popular and being shown in all the movie theaters when the game was finally released in July, I think, of '89.
Now, you've mentioned in the past that some parts that made it into the game were removed from the final movie. Were these scenes that were already filmed and you saw during an early screening of the movie? Or were these scenes that were mentioned in the script but never filmed?
Well, we got a copy of the script to work on to make the game. And there was basically one copy that we shared, and it was, super secret, and we could not, take it home or make any copies. And in fact, the movie industry then, I assume they do something digital now, but at the time, every copy had individual serial numbers stamped on every page of it, so that if you even made a copy, they would know who made who had the original. And we just assumed, we were kind of naive, having not worked on a movie like that before, that they would let us know if there were updates and changes. But in fact, even when we got the script, it turned out they'd already made some changes they didn't tell us about. Some scenes they filmed and never bothered editing them in. Others came very close to being included in the movie, and they just dropped them in the late stages. And we did see an early screening, but it was only about 3 weeks before the public release of the movie, well into our development. And we were frankly shocked. I still remember, and we enjoyed the movie. Ron and David and I went to see it down in LA, the Paramount lot. And but when the credits rolled, we just looked at each other and said, they changed so much. What are we going to do? They cut this scene that's key to the way the whole game opens. The school and the boxing ring was actually part of the original movie, and we thought that was just a great way to start the game out and give you a tutorial on boxing, which was critical in the game. But we went back to Skywalker Ranch and talked about it, and realized that it was potentially we could turn it into an opportunity and be able to mention in our advertising that the game included scenes that were cut from the film. And in fact, what we realized is that there are several mentions in the movie from events that happens in our game, but not in the film that was released. I guess most notably when Indiana Jones and his dad get into the biplane to escape the Zeppelin. I think his dad asks, why didn't you expect that this was going to happen? And Indy says something like, I didn't think they'd fix the radio so quickly. And it makes no sense at the time, but the knocking out the radio operator and sabotaging the radio was part of the script, and it works its way into the game. So I think that was one of the scenes that they must have cut very late on as something that they just thought was making the movie a little too long.
In terms of gameplay, Last Crusade was the first Scum game to include the look and talk verbs. Were these requested by you, as you thought it would improve the gameplay? Or were these features that were already added to Scum and you just decided to be the first to utilize them?
Well, I don't remember. One of the things that was nice about working on that game with Ron and David was that we all respected each other, but we all had our own very strong opinions about things. And we frequently would have one person want to do one thing and the other two would gang up and say, no, we want to do it the other way. And what's interesting is that, at least to my memory, when we had those impasses, it was about equally likely that the one person would persuade the other two as vice versa. It wasn't a simple majority vote kind of thing. We just talked about the advantages and disadvantages. And the verbs, I think, must have grown out of some combination of what we all said. I would guess Ron was probably the one most involved because he was the one who was closest to the work on the Scum engine. But every single game that we did in that era, we would try to improve the Scum engine and we would work from both directions. We wanted to make the engine better, but it almost always was, hey, in this particular game, we'd love to have these features. Could we fit those into Scum? Would they be useful in other games? And those verbs in particular, I think, were ones we realized that we'd probably want to use again in future games as well. And it's interesting. I don't want to jump too far ahead, but working on the Return to Monkey Island game recently, I was just pleased to see how Ron has continued to refine the interface. And if we could go back in time and show them the Return to Monkey Island interface, I'm sure that we would have just been amazed and delighted to see that, oh yeah, this is much better. We should do it this way. But we were still finding our way, how to really make the whole thing work at that time.
Now, in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, you've introduced the Indie Quotient. At the time, Sierra Games also had a point system, but unlike Sierra's system, the Indie Quotient could only accumulate points and could not be reset. So, if anything, it's an ahead of its time achievement system. What made you come up with this gaming mechanic?
Well, that one, I do remember being the one behind it. And that was a response to a problem we had that everybody had, I think, who was making games in the 1980s, and that somehow it became standard to talk about a 40-hour duration of play that you would get from a video game, or some people would say 20 to 40 hours, but that sense that if you weren't getting at least 20 hours and better yet 40 hours of gameplay off of your game that you bought at that point in a box, then you were getting cheated. And that was really frustrating to us because 40 hours of gameplay, that it was fresh and new. Now, if you're playing a fighting game, an action game, or even our flight simulators, it wasn't that much of a challenge. You can just change create a new scenario, add an extra hour or two of gameplay, make a bunch of scenarios of combat missions or a bunch of enemies that you meet in different combinations, and you can play for hours and hours. But our story-based games required a lot of unique graphics and dialogue and a number of other aspects for each part of the story. And once you'd seen the story and once you'd played through a lot of those scenes, there really wasn't a lot of replay value. But we did notice that not everybody wanted that 40 hours and was so insistent about it. And there seemed to be a correlation between the people that were really sort of nitpicking, painstaking, wanting to get every last bit of sort of the juice out of a game, and the ones who complained the loudest if it didn't last for 40 hours. And it occurred to me that with the Indie Quotient system, the way we implemented it, it would give us the best of both worlds. We didn't want to require everybody to play for at least 40 hours because a lot of people wanted a game that wasn't that hard and wanted to be able to get to the end and not put in many, many hours and still not have finished. So with the Indie Quotient and the fact that as you say, they really were an early achievement system in many ways. And as people do now, many of the achievements could not possibly be done in a single playthrough. You had to play through multiple times. And another thing that I was pushing was trying to add a lot of different types of gameplay to Indiana Jones. Having worked on our flight simulators and having that scene with a biplane shooting down or shooting at another airplane in the movie, I thought it was a perfect excuse to do a simple, tail gunner kind of game. And we had a number of things like that we're trying to mix different genres in there. And we figured that way, if you really played every different type of mini game that we had built in and went through every possible variation, you could get every single one of our Indie Quotient points. And it was only the people that complained that there wasn't enough gameplay that would be diligent enough to go through it for hour after hour after hour and get those points. And in particular, it also meant that if somebody called up and said, I paid $50 for your game and only got 22 hours of gameplay out of it, then we trained our call center people to say, well, what was your Indie Quotient? And say, oh, I got 723. That's the most any of my friends got. So you didn't get all 800 points? And basically challenging them to go back and find those last points worked almost every time to get them, content to go back and see what they had missed. And I will admit that we had a brief discussion about what if we said there were 800 points and only put in 799 points. And because we were a little irritated at these people, we actually had a brief discussion about that and decided, yeah, that's probably not going to be good in the long run. So I'm glad we didn't go in that direction.
Nowadays, with achievement systems, there's transparency about the amount of people who actually got each achievement. So you can actually tell if something is actually possible.
Yeah, I mean, in those days, it certainly wasn't possible to monitor any of that. And we were actually kind of running blind a lot of times and having we'd have to find people who had played our games just through, friends and family and ask them what their experience was. And that was some of the best feedback we could get.
Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade also introduced the phrase, "I'm selling these fine leather jackets," which became a running gag in future LucasArts games. Did you come up with this line?
I did, actually. In fact, in the next room in my house here, I have one of the leather jackets that inspired it, because the company sold Last Crusade jackets to their employees. And it was at a discount compared to what the public got, but they were still fairly expensive. And all of us on the team had, paid for our own leather jacket and were enjoying them. And I remember I didn't write a lot of the dialogue in the Last Crusade game, but I did write some of the going on the road to Germany and dealing with all of the puzzles, dealing with the guards. And I remember trying to come up with something, and what would Indiana Jones be able to do as a way to try and talk his way past him, and that just popped into my head. And we had a bunch of catchphrases and ideas. Our boss, Steve Arnold, who I mentioned, had a plant in his office that he called Chuck, and we just thought that was funny. And Chuck the Plant worked its way into First Maniac Mansion, and then virtually every adventure game we ever did, we had to put Chuck the Plant in there. And there were other famous things where we had, objects or storylines that went from one game to another or referred to in another. And when Steve Purcell came in and started to work on our games, he was drawing the Sam and Max cartoons. And long before we did a Sam and Max video game, he drew Sam and Max into most of our adventure games. I don't think they were in the Last Crusade, but I know they're in Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis, for example.
They are in the Last Crusade in Indy's room. I think there's a totem pole.
Oh yes,
and that became a legal issue, because by the time they had to do the remasters, they had to remove the Sam and Max figurines because they didn't have the license anymore. So Steve Purcell knew what he was doing with placing them in the games.
Absolutely. Although, Steve, I think it was just, he just couldn't help himself from, he loved to draw those characters, and he would doodle them on our whiteboards while we were in meetings, and, sometimes put in word balloons of them complaining about the game or how long the meeting was going on. And so I don't think he was being quite that Machiavellian about getting the license going that way, but it turned out well.
Another thing about The Last Crusade is that your brother, Mark Falstein, wrote the Holy Grail that came with the game. Did you give him any pointers apart from the copy protection and the final puzzles, or was he free to improvise with the text?
Oh, we gave him a lot of guidance. And the way that came about was that we, the Grail Diary was an essential part of the movie, and all of our games came with some type of copy protection at the time. And that just was sort of a natural thing. I don't recall who first suggested that we make a version of the Grail Diary and have information in them. Since they're referring to that book all through the movie, it was such a perfect metaphor for copy protection. In a lot of our games, the copy protection had nothing to do with the gameplay. So we thought that would be a good idea. And we said, well, how can we get somebody who can write something about the Holy Grail and do it in this historical setting with some sort of real world context? And I said, well, I know this is a little bit of nepotism, but my brother was a freelance writer at the time who had worked on a lot of, kids stories and adventure games, but he'd also been a medieval history major. And he really understood the biblical context of some of the references about the Holy Grail, and that all just seemed like such a perfect fit. They said, "All right, let's interview him," and he got the job. But we had to actually design a lot of what was in the Grail Diary to interface with the game. So in many cases, we kind of gave him the essential skeleton behind it, and then he added in a lot of the window dressing, the meat on that skeleton. I remember we also did some research. Like at one point, he said, "Yeah, I'd like to have a telegram from Italy to Henry Jones around 1910." And I don't know, do you guys have any idea how to figure that out? And we had this marvelous library that had mostly graphic-oriented books at Skywalker Ranch. And I remember spending an hour or two searching through and finding, it wasn't 1910, but I think I actually found a 1912 telegram from Italy. So we were able to include something that looked as real as we possibly could in the game. And that type of, attention to detail and realism we felt was part of what made our games popular, or certainly what made people want to play them over and over. So we looked for ways to add that kind of verisimilitude whenever we could.
A few months after Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade was released, the design team met for the first time at Skywalker Ranch to talk about The Dig on the day of the 1989 San Francisco earthquake, no less. What do you remember about that meeting?
Well, as you can expect,
apart from the earthquake.
Well, that was a very memorable moment, I have to say. To step back, we first heard about that. It's actually kind of a fun story, and it was related to Last Crusade. That Steven Spielberg is always has been and still is, to my knowledge, a big video game fan, and he played all of our games. George was obviously believed in us, but he really didn't and still doesn't play video games. They never really appealed to him. But Stephen was just amazing, and he was one of us. It was just great to talk to him about that sort of thing. And so when Last Crusade was released, in fact, even with pre-release version, we gave him a copy. And instead of having him call the hint line, we just gave him the phone number of the three of us who were, the project leaders. And he was talking to Ron going through Castle Grunwald in Last Crusade. And Ron related this to us, that in the midst of this conversation, where Stephen would play through something, he'd ask a question, Ron would tell him how to solve it, and he'd say, "Okay, hold on a minute," and he basically kept him on the line for a fair amount of time, playing through the game with a personal. And obviously, we were all tickled to have the opportunity to do that. But in the midst of it, Ron said, "Yeah," I said, "By the way, Ron, so I'm doing this Amazing Stories TV series, and my friend." Oh God, what's his name? Another famous director. I'm not going to remember who it was at this point. He was talking to a director friend about maybe doing an episode of Amazing Stories, but he realized that it wasn't really going to fit in the TV show, and he thought it might make a video game. And would you mind if he kind of pitched that idea to us? And I told him later he missed the opportunity of a lifetime. It's like, "Yeah, Stephen, sure. And I've got this screenplay I'd like you to take a look at. How about we swap?" But, Ron didn't have a screenplay at the time, but we said, certainly we'd love to see it. And that became the core of what became The Dig. So we'd heard about that. And the meeting in 1989 was a kickoff where it was actually where I first learned that I was going to be the project leader on The Dig, because that was sort of, as you can imagine, a very popular, hotly contested thing that everybody wanted to be involved in. And we were having our meeting in the main house at Skywalker Ranch. And as you say, then suddenly the ground started shaking. And that wasn't a very unusual experience for us. We'd been through a lot of earthquakes, even started to joke about it. And then suddenly it got much more intense than any of us had felt before. And Brian Moriarty, who actually studied earthquakes out of his concerns about them, said, "Everybody under the table." And I remember looking at everybody for a second and looking at this huge mahogany table that was big and solid. And then bang, I think almost every one of us was underneath that table watching chandeliers sway in the next room and hearing stuff fall over and crash. Somebody screamed upstairs. It turned out somebody had been shocked when a vase had fallen and almost it hit her, falling off a shelf. And everybody was okay, but made for a very memorable meeting between, it would have been enough to have just, heard about getting to be the project leader, but the earthquake itself, felt like there was some higher power intervening. Maybe that was why the dig ended up taking 6 years from that meeting to actually being released.
Now, for a question that I've wanted to ask you for several decades. What did your version of the dig look like?
Wow. Well, there is some artwork that is available even online that some people have posted. It was very different. It was a combined role-playing adventure game that was an area I wanted to explore. And we've mentioned Sierra, and they were doing the Heroes Quest game, I think the first one around that time. But that was a lot more sort of traditional Dungeons and Dragons fantasy kind of role-playing. This was to make more of a science fictional role-playing experience. And the core of the game was that there were 2 player characters, and early in the game, you end up having to choose which one of them you will control throughout the rest of the game. And the other one becomes an opponent, essentially. At first, you're cooperating, but over the course of the game, as is true to what happened was in part of Steven's original pitch to us in the final game, the team itself starts to break apart and fight among each other. That his pitch to us, by the way, was he had this idea for something that was a mix of the 2 movies, Forbidden Planet and Treasure of the Sierra Madre. And Forbidden Planet had the elements of people in the future going to an alien planet and finding a ruins of an alien civilization and finding out that whatever killed that alien civilization was still around in some form. Treasure of the Sierra Madre contributed a group of people going up into the hills in Mexico, working together to look for gold, finding gold, and the more gold they found, the less they trusted each other until their whole coalition falls apart and they start fighting each other. And he very cleverly, I thought, realized that that would make a really interesting dynamic of having this team, much like Forbidden Planet, but with the whole group fighting each other. And in those days, we talked about doing an entire team of, at least half a dozen people, and it's just too complicated and too expensive for the technology and the budgets we had at the time. So I wanted to do these 2 characters, and they each had advantages and disadvantages. And one of them was a botanist and was also going to study the animals that you met. And you need food, and that person is much better at finding food because they understand how to analyze the plants and animals, and also to talk to the aliens that you find eventually. The other one was more of a techie type, and he was able to fix certain of the technology that wasn't working right, and also had advantages along those lines. So that was the basic core of the game. There's a very elaborate story that was largely done by myself and Dave Grossman, who worked with me on that version of it. And then I turned out to be only the first of 4 project leaders on that project. And the story you see in the final game was about 90% from Brian Moriarty, who was the second project leader. He spent a lot of time developing a very different story that is, pretty much what you see in the final game. But then Dave Grossman took over for, I think, just a couple of months, and then Sean Clark finished it up and finally got it out the door 6 years later.
But while you were working on your version, did you have the plot all planned out?
Pretty much so. It's interesting looking back at the documents, because I still have all of the documents about the backstory and character design and stuff. And I've learned so much more about storytelling and game development, game design, that it is kind of embarrassing to look at it. That there are elements of it that I think were good ideas, but it was way too complicated and way too elaborate a story. I think it's a problem a lot of us had with our video game stories, that we were frustrated, novelists or screenwriters, and ended up putting a little bit too much into them and not focusing as much on what the player was doing as what story was developing. Um, but I do have a story. All of the, at least to the extent that it was done, to the final complications and discussion of what happens at the very end. A lot of it, I think, was really a little too melodramatic, and even to explain it to you would be pretty involved. I mean, given that people took at least 10 or 15 hours to play our games, it was okay to have a lot more in there than you could fit into a movie, for example. But my story involved a very complicated set of factions and the aliens that you meet, and just a little bit too much backstory, I think, that was good for it.
So you felt that there was too much plot and too little gameplay?
Too much exposition, I think. That it's okay to have a lot of plot if it comes out just as part of the story naturally, or part of what you're doing in terms of gameplay decisions. If you have to have the characters stop and talk about what happened before you got there, then you're doing something wrong. I mean, this is true of good storytelling in general, but we were, as I say, still learning how to do it well at that point.
And what was the end in your version?
Well, it turns out that in my version, you find a lot of these aliens who are in suspended animation, but there were a bunch of factions that were fighting and essentially caused the devastation that threw them back into essentially the Stone Ages. And by inadvertently waking up those factions and starting the fight all over again, you have to take sides and help the good aliens basically prevail against the evil ones who caused the devastation in the first place. Which, and itself is not bad in elevator pitch, but there was a lot more detail in there. There were 4 different cities you visit, and there were different factions supporting, each of the cities. And Dave Grossman had a wonderful idea that one of those cities was actually a gigantic genetically engineered creature, and the gameplay takes place inside that creature. And I still would like to do a game set inside a huge living creature like that. We had so many fun ideas that were coming out of that particular one. And that was, as I said, just one of 4 locations. And, there's too much going on to really fit it all into a game. And I think that's part of why I was taken off the project. It's a very complicated time there, and they had a major layoff. But I think it was pretty clear that I was making something that was a little too ambitious. But also working on a project with Steven Spielberg, everybody in the company wants a part of it, and they want to be in at all the meetings. And everyone higher up than me in the company was insisting they be in on all the meetings, just so they could meet with Steven Spielberg and try to impress him with how creative they were. And I've talked to several people who have made games with him that Electronic Arts and other companies put out. Happens every single time he's involved with a game. It really is not as much fun as you would expect being in charge of it, just because you end up having to field all of the different people who just want a chance to hang out with, the famous guy.
Now, was the idea to have ILM on board for the visual effects always on the table, or was it something that was decided after you left the project?
I think it crept in there just as I was leaving. We were talking about ways to make it more impressive. Brian was definitely the one who brokered it, though, and we all knew a lot of people at ILM. And, for both before and after we were at Skywalker Ranch, the games division was adjacent to where ILM was working in San Rafael. So we ended up, meeting some of them, playing volleyball with them or softball, or having lunch with them. And so there was a fair amount of back and forth. And as the games got more sophisticated and computers got better, and also certainly once computer graphics started becoming an issue, then those two groups kind of started to grow together. But that was also kind of an albatross around their neck because it was very expensive getting ILM to do special effects for our games. Much like the licensing, we had to pay them in order to do the game. So it was, spending some of our budget on the game for something that they were doing much better animation than we could do just from our work. But they only were able to do, I think, two major sequences in the dig. I don't remember precisely, but that, and also because it took so long for the game to come out. By the time it did, when they first made those sequences, they were amazing. And then 3 or 4 years later, the game was released, and by that point, it was just good graphics for video games. So sometimes you have to move quickly if you want to impress people.
Now, did you know that you were eventually credited on the dig? There is a special section in the credits called Ghosts of Digs Past, and you're credited there.
I was pleased to see that. I have to say I felt a little sorry for Brian because, as I said, the story was 90% his story, and I think he deserved a little more notice than that. But I am grateful I was credited. It's certainly not the only game that I wasn't there when it was finished, and I got a nice credit on it. So, but it was nice to see that it was acknowledged, and even better actually at an E3 2 years later. I was working for the 3DO company that Trip Hawkins, who had founded EA, had started. And Trip was at E3, or no, it was actually, I guess, still the Consumer Electronics Show back then, and met Spielberg and wanted to show him this 3DO system. And Spielberg said to him, this is great, but if you're making games, you need to get Ron Gilbert and Noah Falstein. They're the best game designers out there. And Trip didn't tell him, I wasn't there, but didn't tell him that I was already working for 3DO at the time. But other people who were with him brought that back. And I was really, to know that Steven Spielberg respected me as a game developer was, definitely one of the high points of my early career.
You should write him down as reference for future.
Well, I ended up going to work for DreamWorks when it started up and working with him and with his sister as well on some projects there. So I got a chance to have a lot of, to thank him for that and also to, get yet another job that he was involved in.
Now, did you play the final version of the dig from beginning to end?
I did. And I think I did need to, either call for hints or go online for one or two pieces of it. But reality is I've never been the best adventure game player, so that wasn't all that unusual. But I did finish the thing, and I enjoyed part of it. I constantly saw things I would have done differently, of course, but I thought it had a really interesting, sophisticated tone. Something that Brian and I really shared was wanting to capture the feel of Forbidden Planet, which came out in the 1950s and still holds up reasonably well today. I mean, it was really well done movie for its time because it really pushed the boundaries of what you could do with science fiction storytelling. And we felt that we wanted the dig to be that. And I think that shone through in the final game, that all the project leaders managed to contribute to that feeling.
And what would you have changed about that game? Something particular, not the game.
Oh, wow. Well, a lot of people, I mean, it's one of the problems with adventure games in particular, particularly from that era, that one of the ways we got our extra hours of gameplay was in making some of the puzzles really hard. And there's always right on the edge of how hard should it be and what should we do. And the skeleton you have to assemble in that game feels to me like it erred a little bit. I actually was able to solve that one without hints, I remember, but only through a lot of painful trial and error that wasn't a whole lot of fun. So that's certainly one of the details. I thought it was a good concept, but I would have gone with maybe something we actually did similarly in Fate of Atlantis was have some puzzles that were simple, and then you use that simple puzzle to build a more complex one on top of it so that you actually kind of do it in stages. And I think I would have tried something like that.
Wait, but did you know that there's a fossil in the lagoon that shows you how you're supposed to build a turtle skeleton?
I heard about that, and I think I eventually discovered it, but it's still, it's a bit more complex in that really good adventure game design, the best designs, and Ron, I think, is the best person to describe this. But if you can feel that it was only your genius and insight that let you solve it, but in fact not realize that we had given you 10 subtle hints along the way, and it took you 8 out of those 10 hints before it finally crystallized for you, then that's the best type of puzzle to have, because we want everyone to have that aha moment, and finding something that gives away what the solution is really, it kind of almost makes you feel like, God, I'm a dummy. I just had to go and find the instructions here. So there are better ways, I think, of giving people that feeling that they're a puzzle solving genius.
Nowadays, it's very popular for fans to demand the release of a director's cut or an original cut of a movie. Now, if they ever ask you to produce your version of the dig the way you envisioned it, would that interest you?
Wow. It's an interesting
let's
question.
do a Kickstarter. Noah's dig.
Yeah. With the success, particularly of the Double Fine Kickstarter that became Broken Age, I have to admit, I thought about that, when they were able to raise 9 times as much money as they started asking for. But no, I don't think so. I mean, I like moving on to new things. There was one puzzle in my version of the dig that it's actually a series of connected puzzles that I'm very proud of, that involved, it took place in a city up in the mountains, and it's very icy, but one of those mountains is a volcano and has some lava spewing. And there's quite a complex series of things you need to do that involve melting and freezing big bodies of water by diverting the lava path or plugging a hole. And what I liked about that was that each single step, as I say, as I was just saying, it's fairly easy to do. And if you do them in the wrong order, it doesn't work, but it's pretty obvious what you did wrong. And you gradually start to figure out what the right order is and start to piece these things together, that you have to plug the hole before it will fill up with water. And then you need to stop warm water from coming in, and it will gradually freeze over. Now you can walk across the ice. But after you've done that, you need to melt the ice and open the drain again to get out, and a whole combination of those things. And all you need to know is that, warm water freezes and eventually boils. Cold water will, you understand. I can make the mistake and people know exactly what's going on. And I would love to make a game that had that puzzle in it, not necessarily the dig.
I'm willing to back a Kickstarter project with just that puzzle. One game with one puzzle, and from beginning to end, only one puzzle.
Well, these days, it's also become so much cheaper to do really high quality games. Certainly, high quality games that have that, 1990s kind of pixelated feel. Mm-hmm. So you may be right. I don't know. I'll keep thinking about that one. I'll give you credit if I ever end up doing that.
Now, when did you leave the dig project?
Left the dig. Let's see, somewhere around 1991 or so. It was in my last year at LucasArts that what happened was, as I mentioned, the version I was doing was stalling out a bit. It was getting to be expensive, and there were some problems. The company, LucasArts at that point, because we changed our name, was in the red. We were having trouble paying our bills. Both of the Indiana Jones games had been record setters and done very well. But this was actually before Fate of Atlantis came out. It was when it was still in development. And I ended up diverting from the dig to work with Hal Barwood on Fate of Atlantis and do the design for that, and and put the dig on hold. And I don't really remember the full sequence. The people who were in charge at that point, my boss, Steve Arnold, who I've mentioned, had left a little bit before that. The new people that some people were promoted, others came in from the outside, and we didn't see eye to eye on a lot of things. And in fact, they mostly left the company not long after. But before they left the company, they first took me off the dig, and then I was part of a big layoff they had in early 1992. So I ended up working the last year on Fate of Atlantis and on being a producer on some other projects. I was a producer for the first 2, 3 months, I think, of Day of the Tentacle, which was great because I got to do brainstorming sessions with the guys on the puzzles in that one. And was for a while assistant creative director of LucasArts. But make a long story short, there was a lot of turmoil. I and a bunch of other people, I think about 10% of the company, were laid off. The people that laid us off quit the company shortly after that. It's kind of a mess for a while. And ever since then, LucasArts, every 3 or 4 years, would have a new CEO and change direction. And that happened 5 or 6 times, throughout the 90s and early 2000s before they were finally acquired by Disney.
Well, don't leave LucasArts just yet. Let's go back to Fate of Atlantis.
Of course.
What was the original pitch for the 4th indie game?
Well, Last Crusade did quite well. It was our first game to sell 250,000 units, which today sounds like a terrible flop, but in those days was a really big hit. And also it was really nice in that the reviews, even today, when I see that it comes up where people talk about what are some of the best games based on movies, it comes up on some of those lists because so many of the games based on films, particularly in the 1990s, were pretty terrible games that were done on a shoestring budget to take advantage of the publicity of the movie. And we really didn't want to do that. We wanted to, have good quality. And because of that, it did really well. And we started kicking around the idea of, could we do another Indiana Jones game? There were no new movies coming out, but there were plenty of books and other spin-off things that were happening. And Hal Barwood joined LucasArts around that time. It must have been, I think, late 1990 or early 91. And we got to know Hal a little bit just because he loved video games and would come and hang out with us when he was working on movies with George. And we got to be friends with him because he made his own Apple II assembly language games and wanted to know more about what we did. And a combination of his interest and us kind of nudging him, he said, maybe I should, put aside movies for a while and make a game with you guys. And I thought, what a great idea. And I don't think the idea came from him to do Indiana Jones, but it seemed like such a natural fit as that was being discussed, that he was a friend of both George and Stevens, and he hadn't worked on the Indiana Jones game, but he had worked with both of them on many other games, the Indiana Jones movie, I should say. But he had never made a full-scale commercial video game. And so they ended up saying, well, what if we paired you, Noah, with Hal, and you can help him learn the ropes and get established as a game developer here. And why don't the two of you, they started by saying that Chris Columbus had written a script for the 3rd indie movie that was rejected, and maybe you could make that into a video game. So I thought, okay, great, we'll give it a shot. But we hated the script, and you can find it online now if you dig. It was, no pun intended, it was a secret for quite a while, but it is available now. If you look for Christopher Columbus and Chris Columbus rather, and Indiana Jones 4 or whatever. It was very misogynistic. There's a student of Indy's who follows him around the world, and she's overweight and is constantly teased because she's overweight, and she has a crush on him, and he keeps humiliating her to try and get her to go away, and it never works. And there were a bunch of other reasons we just didn't think it was a very interesting premise. One of the other reasons that we didn't like is that you're looking for an artifact from Sun Wukong, the Stone Monkey King, who's a major character in Chinese mythology. And we appreciated the fact that they were considering some interesting, non-Western mythology, but nobody, including us, had heard of Sun Wukong at that point. And movies at that point were not selling in China. And it just seemed kind of like an odd choice to pick something that nobody knew. And one of the first things we did when they told us that, we came back to them and said, yeah, we'd rather not. They said, oh, sure, just come up with your own ideas. Great. And the first thing we were thinking of is, what is indie searching for? And we went back to the library I mentioned and narrowed it down pretty quickly to Atlantis as a possibility and Excalibur, the sort of King Arthur, both as things we wanted that you mention to somebody and they will instantly know, what you're talking about and be intrigued by it. And between those two, we gave up on Excalibur partly because it was hard to imagine setting the game in more than the UK. We really wanted indie. We love the movies where he goes all around the world and is finding clues in different places. And we came up with some ideas of Crusaders and stuff, but that started to sound a little bit also too much like Last Crusade or like Sierra's Quest for the Holy Grail. And also with Fate of Atlantis, one of the things that sealed the deal was we've written and talked about this, but in that library we found some early pictures that, I forget whether they were from Plato himself or from people going by his writings, of the Atlantis being a series of concentric circles. And it looks so much like a game map that we said, that's it. This has got to be great. Just think about what we could do. I could hide there. And the ideas just kept popping up quicker than we could even write them down. And that's when you really know that you're onto the right idea, when you just can't keep up with the flow of ideas and it's no longer a challenge to try and brainstorm on it.
Wow, that library at Skywalker Ranch was the gift that kept on giving.
Also, the single most beautiful office space that I've ever seen in my life, huge stained glass dome, Italian marble fireplace that they had, burning wood all winter. It was just a nice, cozy place, big, comfy leather chairs, a Maxfield Parrish original piece of artwork over that same fireplace, a spiral staircase. It was parodied quite a bit in Maniac Mansion, that spiral staircase that goes up, and the library
it's
in
out
Maniac
of order.
Mansion. Oh yeah. And also again in Thimbleweed Park, they also played with that same concept.
Now, in Fate of Atlantis, in the resource files of the final game, there's an early version of the world map that included the city of Cadiz, Spain. Why was it removed from the final game?
Well, with every one of our games, we had great ideas. We would start to work on some puzzles. The artist would start to sketch things out. And then you get to a point where you realize that you're starting to go over budget and over schedule, and you have to cut back. And by that time, I had already left the company. Hal was the project leader and was the one who actually finished the game. He and I went through the whole design phase and writing phase together, but then it was up to him. But my understanding was that they just found ways to combine it with some of the other locations. And we already, I'm proud of the fact that we fit in, South America and Iceland and, so many different places in the game for Indy to go. Thera, which, Santorini, which I ended up going to on vacation years later, partly because of my interest in it from the game. And so Cadiz just felt like, I think, the easiest one to cut back on.
And how early into production was the idea to have 3 paths conceived? Was the idea of the 3 paths part of the initial script, or was it pitched after you saw the way that the script is going?
That was my concept, and I take full credit because Hal and I argued about that one, particularly because it made the game a lot more complex to make. And for a while, he would jokingly but half seriously, I'd ask, how's the game going? He says, oh, your damn 3 paths are just taking way too long. Every single review, and they were almost all very favorable, mentioned that as one of the things that was one of their favorite bits. And Hal said, well, okay, I guess you were right on that one. But that grew out of what I had done in The Last Crusade. I mentioned wanting to do like the machine gunning and even the idea of having fist fight as a kind of a fighting action game. Um, I was the one who pushed for the diversity of different types of gameplay in Last Crusade. But what happened is they were all jumbled together, and if you really liked doing one thing, you probably didn't like doing one of the other things, and it was hard to separate them out. So in the early stages of Fate of Atlantis, I pitched that to Hal, and before he knew how much trouble it would be, he was very enthusiastic about it. But we came up with a bunch of ideas of ways to make it doable, and I think eventually he told me that the game took maybe 1.5 times as long to maybe twice as long to make as if he had done a single path. So it wasn't 3 times longer, but it definitely, had its price. But I think it helped widen the appeal of the game. And something I'm proud of is that, I asked a lot of people what path they chose. Many people only played it through once, which was another thing that we had intended. That, as I had mentioned before, we liked people to be able to reach the end of the game, but we also needed to cater to the people that wanted to do everything. So we kept the indie quotient. And now it was actually so much more to do to go through every single path in the game. And even within the 3 paths, there were side journeys that you could or could not take, that you had to do every one of them if you wanted to really complete every one of the indie points in the full game. So it worked on a lot of levels. It was in there right from the beginning. And it was one of the more interesting parts of our story brainstorming to try and figure out how to work that into the storytelling. And Hal, as an experienced screenwriter, was just wonderful at thinking of things in terms of story development and character arc. And I learned a great deal from him about how to be a better storyteller as well. And it fit into the way we did the 3 paths.
Now, when reviewing the game, people always mention the 3 paths as the main point of replayability of the game. But there are other elements as well that change every time you play, like the name of the collection Indy needs to find at Burnett College. And according to that collection, you have different locations with different puzzles to solve in order to get the Lost Dialogue of Plato. And we've seen randomizations like that in other Scum games, but not randomizations that actually lead to different puzzles. Was that also something you wanted for replayability? Or
I think that was Hal's innovation. I don't remember suggesting that. A lot of that came from the copy protection problems, that by having things that you needed to refer to in our copy protection to find out the ways to analyze them.
Yeah, but that wasn't the copy protection. That was just a puzzle in the game. Like at some point they tell you which
so long
collection.
I've forgotten that wasn't connected to it. I think that was in there then. We did want to have some freshness when you did replay it, because we realized that quite a few people would replay the game. And, you might need to ask Hal about that specifically, even if he does remember. I don't recall about that element in particular. It also is possible there were some things that we thought we were going to put in the copy protection that we may have realized it was just too much to do, but we already had the game design elements in there already. So that's just conjecture, but I think there are several reasons we might have had a randomized puzzle in there. But in a lot of our games, we did try to add some degree of randomness. And I know when I started to see procedural generation, I remember the early Diablo games in particular, about the ways that their dungeons were kind of the same every time you went in, but the paths were different. I loved the fact that it kept it fresh, and you didn't have to just memorize exactly where every enemy was, because they were in a different place every time you played the game. So I've certainly been a fan of that type of thing, but I don't think I had any contribution in this case.
After Ron Gilbert published his Why Adventure Games Suck manifesto in 1989, LucasArts phased out dead ends and deaths from their adventure games. Why did you still choose to leave player deaths as an option in Fate of Atlantis?
Even in '89, as Ron was writing that, we debated it with Last Crusade. Particularly, I remember when Indy has the opportunity to hit Hitler in the middle of a demonstration in the middle of Nazi Berlin. It was like, all right, this you just can't get away. You know, so well, what if we threw him in jail? So come on, they're going to execute him instantly if that kind of thing happens. And we felt in all of the other games, certainly all the comedy games, but even serious ones like The Dig, we felt that it was we're creating new characters and we can keep it consistent, that there is no ending and death in that. But with Indiana Jones, if you make it clear that no matter what he does, he can't die and nothing can harm him, it takes away some of the fun of the game. And one of the first things we asked George and Stephen when we were working on Last Crusade, we had a meeting with them together and wanted to find out how much liberty we could take. And basically they said, do whatever you want. And I think David Fox said, could we kill Indy even in the game? Expecting them to say, well, no, of course not. And they just sort of looked at each other and said, sure. And I think George actually pointed out that the game wouldn't really be canon. It wouldn't, people aren't going to play the game and say, oh, that's it, Indy's dead. They're never going to make another game or movie. And of course, even when you die, we expect people to go back and, go to an earlier save game or a branch. I don't recall about that particular one. I think we made it impossible to be left without a save game to go back to because we knew it, as much as it seemed impossible that Indy wouldn't be killed if he, hit Hitler. We didn't want to discourage people from trying it because it seemed like a really fun thing that Indy would certainly want to do. So we figured
usually in Fate of Atlantis, whenever there's something that's about to kill you, then one of the characters tells you something about it, and the kill is always capitalized, like, I'm going to kill you, and then you need to save the game.
I think that was one of Hal's innovations. But yeah, it gave things a little edge. Of course, you don't really die in a game and just go back and try it again. But all the way back to, Pac-Man, or even before that, Space Invaders, you had that sense of having multiple lives in a game, which has become completely standard in so many types of games that we don't even think twice about it. But at one point, that was a really radical thing. In stories, you don't get that option to just start over and, after you die, or at least in 99.99% of the stories, that doesn't happen.
Now, next month, May 2023, is the 30th anniversary of the CD-ROM version of Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis. It was the first LucasArts game to offer a talkie version in addition to the earlier floppy disk version. I don't count Loom because it was externally developed, as far as I know. Did you consider the possibility of creating a talkie version during the production of the game?
Well, so all of the talkie experimentation was going on while I was there, and in fact, Brian with Loom was kind of leading some of that. It wasn't, the CD with Loom was not even a talkie; it was a radio play and music, because that we could not at that point figure out how to integrate it properly and make it cost effective as well, because it really was a big extra expense to bring in voice actors and deal with all of that. But we kept experimenting. In fact, in my version of The Dig, I did rotoscoping. I actually had a couple of our employees dress up as the two main characters and took my camera out on a video camera out in the parking lot and filmed them walking. And then we took that video and the animators used it to create walking sequences for the characters. And it was really quite good. We were experimenting with all sorts of new technologies and doing it essentially on a very grassroots level where, we kind of kept the price down as low as possible to see whether it was good enough to actually consider. But no, the talkies really didn't come in until after I'd left the company. And I actually, after LucasArts, spent a while working with a company called Digital Pictures that made a number of those full motion video games, where they filmed real actors. And I had some interest in that. And around that time, around 93 to 95, a lot of people were thinking that games would end up being bought out by movie studios and you'd need actors and it would be all live action. And we would use, because the new CD-ROM consoles were starting to come out. And people thought, oh, well, that's it. You'll have a CD, and then later when they came out, DVDs, and you'll play your games with real actors. But I'm happy to say that it almost worked the other way around. Now we have, TV series with real actors based on our games. So it's nice to see that we're no longer the poor, younger child of the movie industry.
Well, at least the FMV era got us Phantasmagoria 2, which got us
there you go.
This channel. Now, I understand that during the pandemic, you found some old design documents of games, including design documents of previous versions of Loom, and a design document for its sequel, The Forge. What can you tell us about the changes that were made to Loom from concept to the final product, and what was supposed to be the original premise for The Forge?
Well, Brian, who was the project leader on that, and I shared an office, and he actually credited me on Loom in part because I really thought he was being extra generous there, but I had talked to him about a concept I had been kicking around for a long time of that I was calling the science of magic, of having a world where magic spells were based on kind of a physics of the world, and that if you did things in the right order or with the right combinations, spells would happen. And if you tried to recombine them, you could discover new types of spells along the way. And that was one of the pieces that he ended up, putting into the music that Loom did. So we talked quite a bit about, where he was going with it. And I don't think it was right at the beginning, but certainly before the game was finished, he was always already thinking of it as the first of a trilogy. He had come to us from Infocom and had worked on Beyond Zork, and that was, I think, the 5th game in the Zork series. So he was already used to that idea of long series of games. And he, if I recall correctly, and this was a long time ago, he worked out a lot of the original concept to Forge, and he also had a name and a setting picked out for the third game, and I don't recall what that was offhand. I'm sure other people who worked on the stuff did. But he didn't end up making that. I think when he was working on the Dig, Kalani and somebody else, some of the other people in our group started to work on Forge. Mike Ebert, I think, who's one of our artists who was interested in design as well. So they took a lot of what Brian had done, started to develop it. There were a lot of tests done, and those documents you mentioned were created by some combination of all those people over time. But as I've said, I mean, it was actually one of our pastimes was to just come up with new ideas and kick them around. And there was a group, it's called the Project Leader Meeting. All of us who had actually been the directors of these game projects were the sort of first line of defense to kind of say, yeah, this is worth discussing, and for internal pitches, and then the management of the company would have the final say about what was greenlit. But those of us in that group and everybody who wanted to be part of that group or wanted their ideas to be heard would make these documents and circulate them. And some of them were great ideas. Some of them, looking back, were pretty terrible, and it was obvious to me why we never really went any further with them. And Forge, I think, could have been a good game, but Loom was basically ahead of its time. It was kind of a casual game 15, 20 years before that became a thing. And as a consequence, the people who didn't like to get less than 40 hours of gameplay were vicious about it, because there was one letter in particular that circulated where a guy talked about how he got the game, he enjoyed a bunch of our games, paid whatever was $50 or even $60 by that time for the game, and 3 hours later he had finished it. And then he gave it to his 12-year-old daughter, and it only took her just slightly longer than him. And how could we do such a terrible thing to make such an expensive game that you'd finish so quickly? And at the bottom, this was all typed, I believe, and at the bottom, handwritten, was, I'm the 12-year-old daughter and you guys suck, or something to that effect. And we thought it was kind of funny, but it was also pretty painful that it was indicative of a lot of letters and responses we got that Loom was just too simple and too easy. And yet we got also a few letters of people who loved it. A grandmother in Nevada who said, my grandson plays video games. And when I said I was curious, he gave me this one. He said, this is a good one for you, Grandma. And I loved it. And what a wonderful story. And I love the music. And tell me, are there other games that either you've made or like anyone else? And that really was painful because there weren't any other games that were really of that same sort of style. And the sales of it were just not good enough to warrant doing the sequels or even more complex versions of it.
Well, maybe it's good that the internet wasn't publicly available at the time.
Well, I mean, it's all trade-offs. I certainly wish that Brian had that idea in the early days of mobile games, and if that had been something that people had played on their phones, or just really would have been or even at Zynga, playing it as a Facebook game or something, I think it could have been a big hit and something where 3 hours would be a really good amount of gameplay time. But it took quite a while. I'm very pleased to see you can make a very successful game these days that can be completed in just a few hours.
Now, you've probably noticed that over the years, there seem to be a lot of unnecessary and sometimes excessive hand-holding in games. What is your stance in the matter?
I really think it's an art. All of us, well, there's a certainly core group of us who were at LucasArts together that are still friends who talk to each other about these things. And that group of us that worked on the adventure games in particular, we end up having a lot of discussions. And we really believe in what I said earlier about wanting the player to feel smart and holding their hand without letting them know we're holding their hand, but also treating them like adults, and basically not sugarcoating everything or making it so obvious that, anyone can finish it easily. But that said, as I said, I look back at my old games and I see all sorts of things that I now, by virtue of a lot of experience, would do differently and could do better. And this is true of writers, musicians, artists. They look back at their earliest work, and you get in decades of experience, you learn how to do it a lot better than when you first started out. And often those first games have really good pieces that you're proud of, but you almost always can look back and say, I hadn't realized that I needed to do it this way or change that around. And I mean, even Ron's manifesto about, why adventure games suck grew out of a lot of mistakes that he made and we all made. I was joking with David Fox about one of the worst parts of Zak McCracken that, even as the game was coming out, he realized he shouldn't have done it, was that you have getting on a bus and paying the bus driver to go places as a major part of the game. And it was really easy to get stuck and have to make more money. And who wants to play the game trying to get spare change for a bus trip? I mean, at the time he thought it would be easy, and it just ended up being a complete headache to implement that in our SCUM system. And in retrospect, with future games, when we started to see that kind of thing happening, we would just give up on it right away and simplify it, because we realized, no, the answer is not to come up with this inordinately complex system to make more money to pay for more bus trips. Make the buses free and forget about, use the time you save to make a different, more interesting puzzle.
For us fans, these games are perfect. You don't need to change anything, and you didn't need to change anything back then. They are perfect as is.
Well, thank you, but not every fan exactly shares that opinion. I could point you at a few who would probably disagree with that. So it's a little subjective there.
Then they are not true fans.
All right, I'm with you on that one.
As you probably know, many of the LucasArts SCUM games have been re-released recently by Limited Run Games in various forms of collector's edition. Recently, Zak McCracken was released as a collector's edition. And the only games that have yet to be released are The Dig, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, and Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis. Basically, all the games you were involved with. Now, I know that a while ago you said that you don't want to do a new indie game, partially because of the initial backlash Ron Gilbert had to deal with when the art style for Return to Monkey Island was revealed. But since then, Return to Monkey Island was released, got great reviews, and became the fastest selling game in the series. And with the new Indiana Jones installment coming out this summer, it seems only appropriate to have a new Indiana Jones adventure game designed by you. And especially with publicity that Indiana Jones adventure games, your adventure games, will get when they'll be released by Limited Run Games, which probably be around that time that the new Indiana Jones movie will come out. So have you changed your mind since then?
So let's see, what year would this have been? 2016, I think. So 7 years ago, they announced that there would be a new Indiana Jones movie. And of course, they've had multiple scripts and directors and delays and changes since then. But when that happened, I went through some of the same thinking, you just did. And I was at a conference in Barcelona that Ron was also speaking at, and pulled him aside and told him that David Fox and I, because David and I live close to each other, and Ron, lived then and now lives up in the Seattle area. We talked about it and thought, what if we pitched doing some kind of retro game, kind of in the vein of what they did for Thimbleweed Park, but a brand new Indiana Jones story, and in some way reminiscent of the old style. We weren't sure. I mean, much like with Return to Monkey Island, we were interested in upgrading it and not trying to make it look exactly like it was, 30, 35 years ago. But Ron was pretty reluctant. He got, kind of burned on the Kickstarter with Broken Age, and it just didn't enjoy that experience very much. And, we talked about the fact that we'd have to get through to Spielberg, who none of us had any direct connection anymore. Been many years since any of us had talked to him or worked with him. And we knew how almost impossible it was to kind of get somebody, not even like that, but him in particular, to get his attention. And we kind of knew that if we bumped into him on the street and, pitched it to him, then he'd tell his people, yeah, let's set up a meeting with these guys. But we didn't want to go through that and have the humiliation of, trying to get him even to hear about it or whatever. And another thing that comes up is that we have all been battered a bit by what happens when you try to do licensed titles over the years. And it's pretty painful when the license holders want to take it in a different direction. We've talked quite a bit about that already here. So ultimately, we toyed with that idea, and I think I'm still under NDA, so I won't get into details. But I will say
NDA about what?
About doing some other Indiana Jones work. But I can say, to the best of my knowledge, and there may well be stuff that I haven't heard about, we have no plans to do that sort of thing now. And part of it is because back then in 2016, I think the movie was supposed to come out in 2019. And I think it's safe to say now they're on the track finally where it is about to be released. But now the time is pretty short. So unless somebody who I don't know is working with some of the other team members on a version, which certainly could be possible, I just don't think that that's in the cards. And frankly, I think all of us have moved on to new, fresher things, and I'm really enjoying the kind of work I'm doing now, which is very different than that old work. And I wouldn't completely walk away from it, but I certainly would not want to take on the trouble of being one of the key characters and making that happen and spending 2 or 3 years of my life trying to kind of relive something from 30 years ago.
That's not reliving something from 30 years ago. It's something new. There's a new Indiana Jones coming out. if they got Harrison Ford to do a new movie after they couldn't get him for I don't know how many years, then they can probably get you to make a new adventure game. Come on.
You never know. I mean, Hal and I have done several games, since then, worked on several games, including a Mata Hari game, which had elements of the kind of collaborative work we did with Fate of Atlantis. I won't say no, absolutely, but it's not very likely. I'll put it that way. Sorry,
I won't end this conversation until you say that you're going to do another Indiana Jones game. Just take notice.
Oh, okay. Well, I've been enough of a puzzle solver to know that this is where I say, I'll do another Indiana Jones game.
This is a dialogue puzzle, like in Fate of Atlantis.
Exactly.
Now, what have you been doing since you left Lucasfilm Games, or back then it was LucasArts?
Oh, wow. Well, it's been, as Indy would say, a lot of mileage since then. I've worked on all sorts of things. I guess the 2-minute version of it is that I ended up being the third employee at DreamWorks Interactive when that was just starting up, and that got me partly because it was a chance to work with Spielberg again on a prototype for a World War II game that later, after I'd left the company, became the Medal of Honor series. So that was really interesting and fun. And working with Spielberg again was great. He's just such a pleasure. But then after that, I went freelance, and since 1996, I've been a freelance game designer, except for a 4-year stint where I became chief game designer at Google, working on a lot of their virtual reality and augmented reality systems. And originally, I was supposed to be the head of design at a 200-person game studio within Android to make games for the Android phone systems. But almost before I could start the job, the Andy Rubin, who was the head of Android at that time, got involved in some harassment scandals. And I didn't hear about this until years later, but all the projects he had in mind kind of got shoved under the rug. And unfortunately, I had to shift gears and do a lot of other work at Google. But since I left Google 6 years ago, and largely because I really wanted to go back to work on something I'd been dabbling in of games for health that help people with healthcare or training physicians or actually treating diseases directly. And that's what I've been doing for the last 6 years. And it's just booming. In fact, the pandemic gave it a boost. And I worked on a game that is now the first and only game that has been cleared by the FDA to be prescribed by doctors. It treats pediatric ADHD, and the studies they've done that submitted to the FDA showed that it was approximately as effective as Adderall or Ritalin in dealing with ADHD, but without the kind of serious side effects you get from pharmaceuticals like that. And it's just one of many projects. I'm working with some people that have a cure or a prevention, I should say, for nearsightedness, which, seeing that you're wearing glasses, I have to say you have to start using this from the age of like 6 to 12 for it to work. But it's a VR treatment that may actually help people have less strong prescriptions or no glasses at all. And there are things to help with chronic pain, to help with recovery from strokes or injuries, games to help with all sorts of stuff out there. And it's very challenging and very gratifying to make games that are, helping people, even saving lives in some cases.
I'm wearing glasses because I've been playing too many adventure games as a kid on CRT screens. So, and all of these games involve some type of XR, either AR or VR, or...
Oh, no, many of them don't. The ADHD treatment just uses an iPad. And VR and AR are really, the health industry has embraced them in various ways. They're useful in ways that the commercial industry hasn't been able to work out yet, but for entertainment. Um, but no, a lot of these treatments or training for doctors and stuff are just done with, computers or phones. You don't necessarily have to use VR and AR.
And how are these games any different from other types of games? Because, for example, even people with ADHD can be invested in a certain game, even if they can't read a book from beginning to end, or even if they can concentrate on anything else apart from that game. So how are these games any different from regular games?
Well, there's a whole range, and some games are virtually indistinguishable from regular games. The ADHD one, as the sort of the most advanced one to take as a good example, you're absolutely right. In fact, one of the things I love about working in this area is that you learn so much about how the brain works and medicine in general. But attention deficit disorder or hyperactivity disorder are kind of poorly named because people who have that condition, it's not so much that they have a deficit of attention, but rather that their threshold to become attentive is higher than normal neurotypical people, which means that if you do capture the attention of somebody with ADHD, they often can go into something called hyperfocus. And one of the most common complaints that would come up from parents was, Tommy can't spend more than 5 minutes on his homework, but then he goes and plays Minecraft for 3 hours straight and I can't get him off of it. So how is that possible that he has this attention deficit when he's so good at the video game? And the answer that the scientists behind this game have found out is that you need a higher level of intensity to trigger that kind of hyperfocus. And in fact, when as a relatively neurotypical person myself have played this game, it's really, really hard, and it's designed inherently to always be pushing right at the very limits of what you can do, because that's necessary to capture that full attention of somebody with ADHD. And then another way that it's different from other games is that it's been specifically formulated to essentially train their brain to help harness and control their own power over their ADHD, specifically by giving them objects that they need to collect and having a lot of objects that go by that are the wrong color or the wrong shape that they have to learn not to hit a button and capture. And by doing that repeatedly, it reinforces the wiring in your brain so that when you're focusing on one thing and a distraction comes up, you get better and better at processing that distraction and choosing when to pay attention to it and when not to. And the theory was that that would help strengthen, almost the muscle in your brain that allows you to not only focus on something, but not be distracted by something else. And those are actually two separate neural pathways, even though they sound like they're two different aspects of the same thing. But by playing the game and then doing tests in a different dimension to see whether people's ability to be attentive and not be distracted is any better, they've been able to prove to the FDA and to the European CE mark people to their satisfaction that this is actually effectively helping people get better, not just at playing the game, but at using their attention, controlling their attention in other activities of daily life.
So it's very similar to how some people need to play white noise in the background in order to concentrate on something else that they're doing.
Well, that's a theory, and I'm interested. I'm one of those people that likes to go to coffee shops and have a general background conversation going on. But if there's somebody near me who I can hear very clearly talking to someone, suddenly I'm distracted and want to follow their conversation.
Yep.
And other people, of course, many people need absolute silence if they want to be fully focused. So there are various theories, including what you just described. As with many things in the brain, it appears to be somewhat more complex than that. It sometimes has to do with the types of things that you're paying attention to or the types of distractions that happen. I know, for example, if I'm working at home and I hear my wife talking to somebody, that's way more distracting than if it's a stranger talking to another stranger. And there's a bunch of things that our brain does to process sound and alert us in different ways that's fascinating and complicated.
Well, that's why we have noise-canceling headphones.
Precisely.
Now, you recently... Go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to say, games that treat conditions are one thing, but there's also a company I've worked with called Level X that was in fact started. Both Level X and Achilles, the ADHD company, had founders who were ex-LucasArts as well. So I think there must be some pattern there in us liking this sort of thing. But the CEO of Level X has made a company that trains doctors through games. And he is adamant that they need to be fun games. It's not game-like things or high score tables. You play these things and they're really fun games, but you have to have an MD to actually be able to have the background to play them. And I've tried to test some of them, and yeah, he has a dermatologist game, for example, and you immediately have to start classifying all these skin lesions as dangerous or not, or this one might be precancerous. And number one, they all look equally disgusting and dangerous to me. And number two, just the thought of seeing these things and trying to figure out which ones are going to, potentially be cancerous, it makes me laugh at the people who think that our video games are too disturbing and violent, because here's real life and it's way more graphic blood and gore than 99% of the games out there. But they're getting continuing medical education credits for playing these games, just like the kind of training seminars they can go to, and having way more fun doing it. And we all believe learning much better because it is fun. And the fact that you remember all these details from your games that were played 30 years ago, I think is one really strong endorsement of how good games are as learning tools.
Now, in addition to that, in recent years, you also playtested 2 new Ron Gilbert games, Thimbleweed Park and Return to Monkey Island. How was it to play new adventure games from your colleagues at Lucasfilm Games? And what did you think of the UI, the puzzle design, the multiple endings of Return?
Well, I'll say with Thimbleweed, that was designed to, the catchphrase was that it's as if they found floppy disks in a drawer where they've been for 30 years. So, and even though it did have innovations immediately that I saw that there's no way we could have done this 30 years ago, like the building that tilts back and forth as you walk back and forth across it. Very minor thing, and it looks like kind of the thing we would do back then, but I immediately started thinking about how would you implement that? There's just no possible way that we would be able to process that many pixels. But I enjoyed that, but it wasn't really my favorite thing. That was really, Ron and Gary have a certain sensibility that was also obvious in Maniac Mansion that I think came through on Thimbleweed very strongly. And not my favorite. They're goofier than I like to get in the games I work on. But I have to say, Return to Monkey Island, well, first of all, like everybody else, I was totally unprepared. And when David Fox actually was the one who came to me and drafted me into the testing, I was shocked that he and Ron had been working on this for years, and I had no idea. That I knew he was working on a project with Ron. I knew Ron was working on some new thing, but he's always working on a new thing. And I was so excited because I love the Monkey Island games, and I did more contributions to those than to most of the other adventure games where I wasn't one of the project leaders. And I started to get worried as I started to test it, because it was so good, I couldn't find much to say that needed to be changed. And I thought, boy, if it was reversed and I was asking Ron to test my game and he says, it's great, don't change anything, be like, what a waste of time. What's the matter with you? And so I did come up with a few things that I thought needed to be tweaked a little bit, but I just kept praising almost every aspect of it. And I really think it is a masterpiece. In fact, I've gone on record online saying that I think that people who do game studies and write, do a master's thesis on video games, there are quite a few of them around now. Return to Monkey Island and the way it does interactive storytelling and the multiple endings and the meta level of storytelling that it does, of story within a story within a story, and plays with who is the real narrator here, and are we even seeing the real story, or are we going to find there's a sequel where this was in the imagination of who knows who? All of that stuff was put in very intelligently and very carefully. And also, and I can finally now talk about this after 30 years, 30 plus years, when Ron was working on the first Secret of Monkey Island, I was collaborating with him on some of the brainstorming. And the first Secret of Monkey Island, as Ron has now gone on record saying finally, was that it was a little bit like Westworld. It was actually an amusement park that had mechanisms underground that were running everything. And that was the secret you find out at the end of the game. But it kind of never happened that way. And for all these years, whenever Ron says, well, I can't tell you what the secret is, there's hardly anyone that knows about it. It's like, oh, I know. I can't tell anybody. And so I love not only that I knew that secret, but they divulge it in such an interesting way and controversial. You could, again, interpret it your own way, depending on what your biases are. But I do know that, some of the original concepts for what that secret was were why you end up going through the very end of Monkey Island 2. And that got such a bad reception by so many players. I think it scared off Ron about ever revealing that ending until he and Dave, in particular, Dave Grossman, were able to figure out what they were able to do with Return to Monkey Island, which, gets very deep and philosophical without ever slowing down the gameplay or getting in the way of the fun. In fact, it makes it, I think, an even funnier game because of the levels that they play with the narrative there.
Mm-hmm. And did your suggestions make it into the game?
I have yet to play through the final game. The version I played through had a whole bunch of white box cutscenes, and I keep meaning to do it, but I have so many things going on. I just have not. It does take a lot of time to play through these games, and I enjoyed playing all the way through that one the first time. But of course, the second time, it's no longer quite as exciting to see, the reveals. And yet, I haven't seen about 80% of the animation because I started playing it when they hadn't finished any of the complex animations. So I will at some point, and I guess I'll have to, let you know at that point. I think there were a couple of things involving a puzzle with a blowfish, I'll say, that I think were a little bit too complicated. And Ron said in fact, he said they were already working on that when I told him that I agreed that it was a little too counterintuitive compared to the others. But the vast majority of the puzzles in that game, I felt were exactly in the sweet spot I described, where I kept feeling like I was being really clever at figuring them out. And then sometimes later I could see, oh yeah, I missed a few hints, but there was enough there for me to feel like I was the brilliant one going through it all. And I never gotten into that really frustrating, I have no idea what to do, I'm just going to go back to every single room and try every object with every other object. But, I've had some games that I've had to do that, and this never got to that point for me.
And now there's even a writer's cut. You have an option in the game to activate a writer's cut and play an even longer game.
I will definitely do that. Dave Grossman and I have a lot of us have worked together on those games, but also in different combinations on other games. And Dave and I did some consulting together, and I love his sense of humor. He has a very distinctive, dry, sarcastic sense of humor that creeps into the games. And I would see there were a lot of times where I would see stuff in Return to Monkey Island. So yeah, that was all Dave right there. And I guess Ron has come out and said that Dave did actually the majority of the dialogue writing in the game, which didn't surprise me. It just has his fingerprints all over it.
Now, before we conclude our conversation, I have a few questions from our viewers.
Sure.
AT Machine asks, are there any game ideas that you particularly wanted to make at LucasArts, but didn't get the chance to, and would still like to someday?
Yeah. I don't know. I'm not urgently waiting to be able to do them, but two that come to mind. One I already mentioned about the science of magic and the idea of designing actually, the full concept I have is several different magic systems that all work together in different ways, with the core idea being that you, the player, it's not like you press, the function 7 key for this spell. You actually have to, move your hands in a certain way or say certain words out loud and get the intonation and the volume and the accent just right. And if you get it wrong, you might trigger the wrong kind of spell because they all have consequences and they're all logically based on things, so that if you can throw fireball and you can change the verb for fireball or the noun for fireball to ice, you can throw an ice ball. But then some things, whatever. It's very complicated. I've done some thinking about it, and I'd love to do that in virtual reality now, where I think you'd be able to do some amazing things where it would feel like you really were a wizard. So that's one. The other one is one that I got to develop a little bit with Orson Scott Card, the science fiction writer. He worked with us on the Secret of Monkey Island games, and he did a lot of the Dig writing as well. Mm-hmm. And this one is about humans who get picked up by aliens and put on board this giant space ark. And the aliens are collectors who have been going from planet to planet collecting different species. And interestingly enough, it's very, very similar to a game Hal Barwood wrote before we met each other. So we already were thinking along similar lines. But in my concept, you as the humans break out from your little cell and end up having to meet and win over the aliens who are also captured to overthrow the people who are running this spaceship and get you all dropped off back at your home planets. And I really like that idea. In fact, I was starting to work on it when the Dig came along, and the Dig was, so close in a science fictional feeling that I said, all right, I'll shelve that for a while and come back to it, and never had a chance to do that. So both of those games, I think, would be a lot of fun to do at some point.
I'll back both of these games. Just launch Kickstarters for some of these games. Space Quest Historian asks, in Fate of Atlantis, there are a ton of minigames, following the Fez guy through the crowded streets, chasing Trottier, piloting a submarine, etc. Which do you think came out the best, and which do you think, in hindsight, may have been a bit wonky for an adventure game?
Wow. That's a tough one. I have to say it has been way too many years since I played through Fate of Atlantis. And I did, because I had left the company before it came out, I did play it sort of fresh when it was finished, even though I knew a lot of the story behind it. But the mini games in particular were new to me because Hal had developed those after I left. And of course, I didn't know how to play them well. What I recall, I think, is that for me at least, the balloon one was perhaps my favorite. And I don't recall why. I just remember something about the way that game felt that just sort of captured the feeling of being in a balloon that really appealed to me. I don't really recall. I know a lot of people complained about piloting the submarine into Atlantis on one of the passes being really difficult. And personally, I do remember thinking that was pretty much appropriate difficulty. But because of all the flight simulators that I worked on, I might have been, an atypical person for that. So, yeah, I don't recall. I do remember that it's ironic because I pushed on having a lot of the action games in there, but action games are not my forte and not something I enjoy that much. So it was my least favorite of the three paths.
Okay. Michael Clamorous asks, as the first elected chairperson for the IGDA, do you have any advice for people trying to build up their local game dev communities?
Wow, interesting. Well, thank you for being nice and precise about the language I use there. As the very first chairperson appointed himself, so I just take pride in actually being elected. Yeah, well, for one thing, the IGDA is still going stronger than ever, and they publish information on starting your own chapters and groups there. So that's absolutely the first place I would go. And also compared to when I was doing this, it is so much easier to find, number one, a bunch of suggestions online from people who've started their own online communities or even local physical communities. number two, dozens of apps, from Eventbrite to, whatever. There's so many ways to just set up things, and Meetup is another one, and get these things going. And third, just finding like-minded people, either in your local area or in the entire world. It's hard for me as somebody who started in a pre-internet age to feel like that's a difficult thing now, that I'm the wrong person to ask, but I know there are a lot, there are millions of more correct people who are just a few clicks away. But definitely the IGDA, we have a breakfast at the annual Game Developers Conference every year, where all the former chairs of the IGDA are invited, and we don't all show up at once, but there usually are anywhere from 7 to 20 people, and we're all passionately interested in building community of game developers, and I still believe the IGDA has a lot of good it can do in that area.
Cool. Gear Token asks, what are your thoughts on being a game designer now versus back then? What would you recommend to game designers now differently than what you would have back then?
Well, I certainly wouldn't recommend that they start by learning assembly language, which was pretty much necessary in 1980. Let me turn that on its head a bit and say, as somebody who has managed to work in games for 43 years and counting, what is absolutely necessary for that to be practical is for you to have a love of learning and also want to try new challenges all the time. Because I've had to reinvent myself over and over again over the years. And over those years, I've had friends who didn't reinvent themselves and had a brief time where they were doing exactly the work they liked, and then it fell out of favor. For example, doing artists who do pixel animation that would be very familiar to the people in this group. For a while, because of the limitations of the computers, we had to, play around with swapping colors and color registers and making it look like it was animating when it wasn't really animating. And nobody does that anymore. And, even by, the year 2000, nobody was doing that anymore except for games that were showing off the old stuff. So if you aren't willing to learn new stuff, new techniques, new areas, you can be left behind. So for example, you may love Minecraft and Minecraft-like games now, but I would not assume that Minecraft in its current state is going to be around 20 years from now. There will be games that will reach the same type of audience at that point, but they'll be radically different in many ways. So you always have to be looking forward to what's coming out next and jumping on to see which areas are growing and which ones are dead ends. And if that doesn't sound very appealing to you, if you just want to do one thing and just do that for the next 40 years, then designing video games is probably not the best path.
And one last question from me. What are your plans for 2023, and how can people stay in touch with you and your work?
Well, I'm pretty easy to find. I'm the only Noah Falstein so far on the internet. Of my Falstein clan is a fairly small one. And happy to have people reach out to me. Please do try and tell me, whichever method you use, why it is that you're reaching out. Because I do just get random connections from people that I often don't follow up on. And I'm going to be getting back into speaking. With COVID, I really missed that. I have plans. It's not 100% confirmed, but I should be teaching a class on creativity in game design in a bunch of cities in France in June. And again, if you look up my name and France and news, I think you'll probably get that as the first Google hit. And I have discussions with people in various other countries and cities in the US to possibly be giving talks. So, use Google. I've spent enough years at Google to know that's best way to find me. And I will be available at conferences and easy to find for a LinkedIn connection if you're interested in the games business and would like to connect to me that way.
Being the only person named Noah Falstein is great SEO on Google. It's the best SEO.
It's great, although it has a few negatives there. But I have friends who have much more common names, and a friend of mine named Bob Harris, for example, he was cursing about something one day, and I said, "What's the problem?" He says, "Oh, I'm never the only Bob Harris, even in a given town that I'm in. There's so many of us." And a bill collector calls me, and I say, "Oh, no, I'm not that Bob Harris." And he says, "Sure, you're not that Bob Harris." So yeah, I am glad that I'm the only one, but it also, his experience made me realize I'd better be careful, because anything bad I do, I can't say, "Oh yeah, that was another Noah Falstein." So it goes both ways.
Well, you're the most successful Noah Falstein out there.
Thank you very much. I'm the most successful one you know.
Well, thank you so much, Noah, for taking the time to join me in this conversation. It's been a real honor chatting with you today.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure, and I really appreciate the quality of your questions and your humor.
So there you have it, folks. That was my conversation with Noah Falstein. If you enjoyed this conversation and wish to support the channel, please consider joining us on Patreon or donate via Ko-fi. Links are in the description. Anyway, stay tuned for my next conversation with Scum legend Eric Wilmunder, which will premiere in the next couple of weeks. That's it for today. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.